So let's start with. You don't necessarily have to raise your hand, but let's try to give everyone a chance to speak. So who'd like to ask the first question?
You said the Federal Reserve prints money out of nothing.
Yeah.
So is there a limit? I mean, how far they can go in printing the money?
There's no limit. There's no limit. But there is no limit. They decide how much, and now you can see that they're putting trillions into this money supply now. It's not regulated, and the Fed is not regulated. There is one politician called Dr. Ron Paul, who has been pushing for regulation of auditing of the Federal Reserve, and has pushed for, and hopefully he'll get the Republican ticket, but he needs everyone's support if you're American. But yes, it's not regulated.
So that's the deficit, basically. What the government borrows from the Federal Reserve, that's the deficit. And then the government borrows from some other countries money to basically return money to the Federal Reserve.
They borrow money through bonds, as far as I know, and those bonds,
Treasury bonds, right?
Treasury bonds, T-bills. But there'll be a time quite soon, I'm guessing, that they won't have the money. They'll default on the T-bills because they borrow so much, and when that time happens, gold and silver is going to go rocketing up, and people are going to lose their. It's going to create massive debt.
If we were to step outside the banking system and adopt another system like gold or whatever, I mean, if they were to call like markets in tomorrow, I mean, how catastrophic would it be to just what percentage out there is actually been printed out of thin air money, and what is actually gold?
That's a good question. What percentage is being printed out of thin air? I would imagine about 90%.
So 90%
I'm
of
guessing
what we buy and
this is
sell
just
would
a guess.
disappear for the year. Get rid of it.
Yeah, I'm guessing it would be that people need to. It's going to be very, very painful, but at least it's real. At least you have something, and the banks can create money out of thin air 9 times more, and the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air. So there's a lot of loose money.
Another quick question. What do you think about it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, they had they had a day where everyone pulled their money out of the federal banks and put them into credit unions. Is this something that's actually like credit unions? Are they not part of the Federal Reserve system? They're completely independent?
They're cooperative.
Ah.
So they're locally based.
They're administered by a board of directors that are, and you have to be a member to be in a credit union. When you open an account in a credit union, you become a member of the credit union. And when every year there's a general assembly, and you can vote on policies and what's happening there. Now, some of them are pretty big, and it's becoming so big because they have to be big players as well, and if they want to have the same.
The audio union has a credit union. The audio union is credit considered one of the biggest.
I don't know if it's the same thing, but I know we have them in Canada, in the West and the East, and I know they exist in the US. But when you now to compete with interest rate and everything, and to compete with banks, they're becoming so big that they're not the little credit union that they used to be. So, everything's getting bigger.
Okay, more questions for Tom?
Prior to 1981, the circulation of money being printed is being coupled with being pegged to the price of gold, and now it's been decoupled. Of course, we see a lot of problems. But prior to the decoupling, was Fed working as it should? Working towards the interest of the nation?
No, they still had. Like any, you can call it a cartel. Like any cartel's interest is to make money and to gain a monopoly, to stabilize the monopoly, so they have control and no other competitors take a piece of their action. So they were, whether the Fed also have the power to change interest rates. And so they would change interest rates to levels which would encourage borrowing, and when companies borrow, or when people borrow, they must pay interest, and of course the Fed makes money out of interest. So there was actually in the past there was a movement by companies to actually save their money and then invest it again rather than borrow. And the Fed really didn't want that. So what it would, because it can't make money if no one's borrowing, so what it would do is entice people with very, very low interest rates. But of course they wouldn't say, when they're saying it, they're like, well, we're doing it for you, this is to stabilise the economy. This is in the people's interest, but of course it's not in their interest, it's in the interest of the private bankers to make money.
More questions?
The stock exchanges, and in a way, the speculation can create more money, and it's also based on nothing but thin air. So is that part of the same system? Is it like that?
In times...
does the legislation allow that? Is it the same legislation that allows the banks to do what they do? Allows speculators to increase?
With the, as far as I know, with the Glass-Steagall Act, and there's been a massive deregulation. So investment banks can act as banks, and banks can act as investment banks and produce all kinds of crazy stuff. So there's a lot of, it's like the wild, wild west out there, and eventually, the Fed is, we talk about the bailouts of 2007. That's not the first time the Fed has encouraged bailouts. There's been bailouts, been about 5 or 6. I can't name them for you, but that's a big part of their job, is so that the bankers never lose. It will always be passed on to the people if there is an economic collapse.
Tom, do you know? Sorry, the Federal Reserve is not part of the government, but it's like there's one agency that where is the offices for the Federal Reserve, and that's part one, where are the offices for the Federal Reserve, and part two, I guess what I mean by the offices is where do they have meetings to say talk about the relationships between the government and the Federal Reserve. And the second part is, what's the relationship between the Treasury Department? Because the Treasury Department is an actual department of the government,
Yeah.
and then the Federal Reserve, and how are they different?
Okay, to answer your question, the Federal Reserve system is a hybrid. It's not controlled by the government. So they're working together. It's half government. It enjoys the backing of the government, and it's also a private banking, has private banking interests. The head of the Federal Reserve in America is Liberty Street, and if I was American, I would be telling everyone, don't be down Wall Street, get yourselves down to Liberty Street, because they created the problem. Now, in answer to the Federal Reserve system, yes, there are offices, and they have certain, and it's made out to look as if they all have different little, authorities here and there, but actually it all goes up to the triangle, and it really goes down to just a few men who really have the control. And the Treasury is part of that. The Treasury would say, when the government says, I've got no more money, the Treasury will say, we'll go down to the Federal Reserve. So they walk down to the street, and then the Federal Reserve has been waiting for them.
I remember now that you're talking about that, who brought these 7 people together at the beginning? Because if they weren't allowed to say their names or whatever, who was the instigator of that?
Good question. From my understanding, it's not clear. But what is clear is that there was prior to 1913, there was what's called the cartel period, where once these big giants had established themselves, it was a part of it's okay to have 2 or 3 big players, but no more than 2 or 3. They don't want to have other competition. So you saw in the past that these big players were saying, okay, I'll take this country, you take that country, we can share this pattern even, and so they were working together in a way, and I think this was just an extension of them working together to try to, really cement their position as the number one, so that
An extension of the European central banks, or the Central Bank of England or something.
all the Federal Reserve. Now, this is a good point. The Federal Reserve is just a copy of the first central banking system, which was 1694, the Bank of England. So this is nothing, this isn't a totally new thing and that's why it was so important, and the most important person there was Warburg, because he'd already helped set up, or he was in charge of central banks in Europe, and he knew how to set up the system. So,
More questions?
If the Federal Reserve always prints money during wars, as you say, United States, a lot of wars, how come the American economy doesn't break down? How come there is no inflation? How come it's still there?
well, I would argue there is inflation. I mean, you just got to look at the price of things. If you compare, like the price of a can of Coke in and you can date it back decade by decade, from 2000, 2010, 2000, 1990, and you'll see that there is inflation.
It's just not It's just not hyperinflation. There is inflation. It's just not hyper.
Okay, every country has little inflation, of course, but
What I think you're going to see in the future is, I think you're going to see some move. You look at Zimbabwe. 2 years before hyperinflation happened to them, these things can happen very, very quickly. And like at one time it was worth, you could buy a bottle of water for $2 Zimbabwe. 2 years later, it's $2 trillion. Things can happen very quickly. But I would argue that you're going to see more and more inflation as this thing called quantitative easing. Don't let them fool you. When they're saying stuff like quantitative easing, they're putting in these very special words. All these things are QE1, QE2, QE3, is printing money. Okay, printing money out of thin air, which will, once it goes through the system, which I don't think it has done yet, is going to cause prices to go up much higher.
Well, we have a question here, Michael.
Yeah. I would like to ask about the secrecy of this group, right? Because it's been a very secret association,
Yeah.
but nowadays we know about them, right? And how come that this knowledge about them has been produced, and by whom, and how it was kind of discovered, and when the resistance started, right? Because for a long time it was concealed, it was invisible, right? It was mechanism was going on, but we didn't know about it. So now we do.
I just think it's about places like this and getting people informed. It's not something that is immediately obvious to people. Again, it's been very carefully planned out. It's not, they chose the words very carefully. Federal Reserve System. They chose it. So if just to the average Joe and you and me, it would be like, oh, sounds like a very respectable organisation that's government backed and it has a lot of money behind it, because there's a reserve, there's a system. But it's not. It's a deception. And the way people started to hear about it was the actual people themselves, the 7 men. After it had been put into Congress and passed and they got what they wanted, they started to boast about it. And you have like Van der Linde himself saying, it would never have gone through if they knew what it was. And they knew exactly what they were doing.
Think about like, I mean, a lot of the money that was printed, the government's borrowing, like you said, is to fund wars. And,
Yeah.
I mean, there has to be some consensus of the people. I mean, in terms of responsibility. I mean, if your government's been at war for 10 years, and I mean, especially America. America doesn't hide. They make no bones about saying, you know, we're spending this money because we're fighting for freedom, and that's sort of under the guise of there is no expense. There's you know, spare no expense. It's you know, for the ideal of freedom, democracy, and they do go to the people. I mean, from time to time. I mean, they don't ask for like, you know, yes or no, but they do go to the people and say, you know, should we be fighting for freedom? They don't say, should we be spending the money, but should we be fighting this fight? And
there is a support for it, yeah. There is support. So yeah, I think there's a responsibility of the people, but I think if the people knew that it was going to make everything, if they actually said to them, hey, we want to go to war with Iran, like, if they want to go to war with Iran, but it's going to cost every family $3,000 per year. Do you want to do it? People are say no, but that's what will happen. You know, there is a cost. And I think if people realise that, they wouldn't be so gung-ho about it.
If you put it into like in simple terms, you think about, okay, if mom and dad are going to spend X number of dollars and you realize that the family only has this much money, it doesn't take a great deal of wit to realize that there's going to be dire consequences. And I don't know what it is that puts us to sleep. When we think about just connecting the dots between spending the money and what's going to do to us in our economy, but it's a very simple equation, I think, understanding.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people who dream of being someone else, and then they buy their way into being someone else, and then what do you see out there on TV and everywhere?
Yeah, I know there's a
movies,
million distractions and like.
No, but on the like the media is selling you being someone else, being rich, being whatever, and then it's for some people who don't have the time to think, or they're just working and don't have the time to think. They just like work, let's say, and then all they want is to have a little break and say, okay, I want to feel rich for one day, so I'm gonna buy this kind of junk, whatever, and then I'm gonna feel like I'm not working my ass off all the time, and I'm gonna have another image of myself instead of being yeah.
We have more questions for Tom. Tom, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely the media has a role to play. I mean, you know, the inception of PR, Edward Bernays was like the first man to realise that he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and if you're interested, there's a great series called The Century of the Self you can watch on YouTube, and that will go to. I mean, things are very carefully worded, you see, and you know, like the Patriot Act. If we're against it, that's but you're not patriotic. You're not a true American. But actually, you to be a true American, you should revolt against that. But it's worded like that, hey, if you don't support it, there's this whole group dynamic thing going. Like
if you're not with us, you're against us.
Carolyn's points, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's the you can't get through that gateway thing. We're fucked essentially. That's the thing that we understand here.
Do we have more questions for Tom? Are there any more questions for Tom? Angel?
No, I'm good.
Oh, sorry, Boris.
Oh, last summer I read the book about biography of J.P. Morgan, and actually he mentions that thing that you said at the beginning. He mentions about meetings like that because he died prior to that in 1913. So he actually talks about meetings with only imaginative names and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think that the feds are still regulated the same way that the first meeting was met. Then 7 people for 8 years mandates and stuff like that. It's still very secretive the way it works. But the other thing that he mentioned, and it was very important to me, and where did I come here is because Tom mentioned that they picked professors to do the propaganda also, and they still do that. Everything that we study now in economics are written by the same losers and idiots that created all this. Like if you watch Inside Job, the movie, and there is a professor there called Hubbard that actually signs everything that these feds say. He says he's one of the biggest professor, one most important professor in United States, and he's working on this side of the feds. And we are studying that. Everybody is studying that actually in the Western world and here in East, because we are in East. They are using the American books, but actually he's the one here that signed the derivatives. He was backing them up. So that's if we go to Liberty Street, we also have to go to the universities and chop some heads there.
Good point. Is that Benjamin Strong? Is that the guy? But yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about, I mean, the information is there. We hear the words, I think, a lot, but if what we're hearing doesn't support our way of life or our idea about the direction that we want to go in, then we reject the idea, even though we should recycle, we should do this, we should do that. We know these things to be true, but at the same time, we don't do them because we have other voices in our head telling us to do this and this because we'll be happy if we do this.
Watch the game,
Watch
go
the game
shopping.
from all different directions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you want, like, I've given you quite a lot of information here, but it's nothing you can watch or read the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, or you can watch his presentation on YouTube, The Creature from Jekyll Island. I got a lot of my information from him. This guy called Edward Griffin, and he's a very well-researched guy. And if you're interested in looking at it anymore, then welcome you to do that.
What's the other series you saw from YouTube? Just before?
Century of the Self.
Okay.
And another one, the Century of the Self is about the use of PR, the rise of PR, and how it's.
We've got about 10 more minutes if anyone has any more questions.
Do you think of buying locally as opposed to buying, like, I mean, corporations obviously have access to more of this phantom money than maybe the local business buyers. So do you think that it has an impact? And if you think about where you're spending your money, that's a good way to sort of go against or protest.
Yeah, I think that's what I think. Buy locally, at least you're giving some money to the people who, you know. And I think if you want to protect yourself, gold and silver are going to be, the ones to. Because there is a chance. I don't want to put the fear into you, but I think that we could really be going into some big, because of this fractional reserve banking system we have and printing money, we could really be moving into some serious problems. It can't last forever, that's for sure. And but gold and silver, when it does happen, you'll see gold and silver. Obviously, that's real. It's tangible.
So, Thomas, basically, from what you're saying, the logic is that the bankers are earning on the deficit. As bigger the deficit, that's what they're earning on. Basically, because the government still does acquire money from the taxes, and then there is a projection of how much the economy is going to produce this year, and then based on this projection of how much the national economy is going to produce, and the taxes they're going to get, this is the plus. And then if they want to spend more than that, that's a deficit. And for that, they borrow from the Federal Reserve. So basically, these bankers are earning on that. That's what you're saying, right?
That's right. Plus, they must pay the interest.
Plus the interest, right.
And I think Griffin even said that almost all of your taxes, if you're American now, will just go to pay the interest to these private.
Which doesn't make sense. Why would you pay interest to yourself? I mean, if Federal Reserve is America and then the government is also America, why would America pay interest to America?
It's not just America, it's private.
It's the
private
bankers. Yeah. It's the bankers who get the money.
Right.
So we should. I mean, if I would just seize all their assets, freeze them, totally abolish the Fed, get back to a gold standard, and we can save it. We can turn this thing around.
I think when you said the taxes go to pay the interest, I think it's like the if you work it out, it's personal income tax, and if people would just stop paying their personal income taxes, the government wouldn't have money to pay back the Federal Reserve. And if I think It was a question you asked earlier, John, maybe like, or somebody asked how much of the money is actually backed by something tangible. If people went and took all of their money out of the banks all at one time, the banks would not be able to pay the people.
That's right.
If people stopped paying their personal income taxes, the government wouldn't be able to pay back the Federal Reserve. I think, like you said, the national debt of the United States is $14 trillion. How large does it have to be for it to become totally farcical? $100 trillion?
I think it's the idea of debt for the American government. They redefine the word. It's not debt anymore. It doesn't carry the same kind of
It's the fourth
negative
dimension.
connotations or the weight that most
Well,
of us.
Tom, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, I think that the thing you need to realise here is the government never has an intention of paying back the money. They only have an intention of paying back the interest on the money. So they've got no interest in actually paying it back, in my mind. It's just that can they keep the system going? As long as they pay the interest, they already get money, so why do they need to pay it back?
Final questions? We have a couple more minutes.
Actually, that's just what you talked about, like in buying a home in North America. Most people buy a home, they don't buy one home and live in it. They buy a home, they live in it for a few years, they buy another. Most of my family has done this, and the idea that we actually, we do pay back the debt, but in a sense, it's not about the debt. The debt's there, but it's not, it doesn't feel like debt, like the way I mentioned. Like in Southeast Asia, debt's a much bigger, there's a much bigger impact on people than it does in the West. We think debt's helpful. It encourages growth. If we don't take on debt, then we're limited to our capital, and then we can't expand beyond our little bit of gold that we have.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a good thing.
Yeah, there is a case to be said that, like, well, in the past, there was, charging interest was considered a sin.
Yes.
But now, later they said, well, we need to expand. And of course, if you can lend more money out, economies can expand. This is true. And so they gave these banks more power. But I think now is to lend out more than they actually had. But now I think it's totally out of control. And I think if people really want to protect their wealth, we've just got to all do something about it. In terms of there's no need to pay interest to these private bankers who's created nothing.
Tom, do you think there's any way out of this recession or depression that we're in? Is there any way out of it?
Yeah, I would hope so. Yeah, I think essentially we've got to get rid of these private bankers who are paying interest to. We've got to cut these institutions out. We've got to cut printing of fiat money backed by nothing, and get back to some kind of gold standard where everyone knows, okay, this is backed by something. It might not be perfect, but at least it's something tangible.
But
So
for
we-
that to happen, Tom, you have two choices. To me, it's clear. Maybe I'm wrong. But either you put out bombs, or you join the group, and you have to be so numerous into like political parties and being in the legitimate work of things, that you have to flood either the Democrats or the Republicans, and do a massive work of education that's going to take a while, but it can still happen faster than it used to do. Either you go this way, educating people and talking about it. If either you have to go in the system and then work the system your way, or destroy the system.
I think that the good news is that
It's sad.
you don't need everyone to buy in, to have a change of mind. Everyone else will follow. You only need about 3% of committed people who can get into positions of government power, who can really influence everyone else, and then everyone else will follow. It's always
You
been
have to
like
be
that.
put there
Yeah, we've got to basically be proactive. That's the thing.
and vote.
Vote and just be out there.
The few people at the top that hold most of the wealth, they're the ones you have to, in terms of changing people's minds, you have to convince them to let go. And that's the
It's
hardest
not
thing.
gonna happen,
How do you
yeah.
tell rich people that you don't need to be rich? You don't need to accumulate this. They're they're almost beyond our
Yeah,
reach
but-
in that sense, but I mean, there's,
But some of these people are actually like, they're close to psychopaths in the sense of,
Yeah.
do you know that guy who's in prison now, the
Oh,
guy?
French guy.
No, well, maybe him too, but
Probably
there's
one in every country.
the guy with the Ponzi scheme.
Madoff.
Yeah, Madoff.
Madoff.
Well, I mean, when people look at him and spit on him, all he is just a picture of the real system now,
Mhm.
impersonated into one person. Like, I mean, incarnated in one person. Like they're doing that exactly. So,
but I mean, you can't have.
but
the
there,
heart
he
to
is a
get that much.
psychopath. He has like no.
In order to accumulate that kind of wealth, there's no way you can have a heart and really care about humanity in any kind of way. Because
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
not even there. It's like it's.
yeah, it's absolutely.
They're not living in reality. People don't
Tom,
exist.
do you know if now that you mentioned this with the banks and the Federal Reserve System, like other countries also have. So how about, do you have information if the ex-Soviet Union had a Federal Reserve?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'll be interested to find out.
Because they were also spending a lot of money on weapons, but their economy was very bad. So where did their money come from?
They do have a lot of natural resources.
Yeah, natural resources.
Who knows? Yeah, it's an interesting question. Be something to learn, find
Well,
out.
for a long time, they also had very cheap labor. Just like this week.
Free.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have, so thank you, Tom.